Okay, well, hi everyone, and welcome to a mini lecture on Victorian Poetry 2. So, you're going to need the packet that has the poems by Robert Browning and the long poem by Swinburne. I think I've also included Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. That was my intention. If I didn't, then I will um, give it to you later. I'll definitely make it available on Carmen. Um, in any case, so if you remember last time, we talked about Alfred Lord Tennyson, and we talked about a little bit about Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and we talked about the ways in which romantic poetry kind of left us two different strands coming out of um, Romanticism into Victorianism. And those two strands, I roughly said one was corresponded to Wordsworth and one corresponded to Keats. And the Wordsworthian one, uh, had something to do with duty and reflection and well, duty and reflection, and had something to do with being more kind of responsible um, to the larger political culture, and that was one aspect, and the other, and that was Wordsworthian, and the second one was I said was more aligned with John Keats, and this had more to do with sensibility and beauty. And this corresponds with Keats's dictum at the end of Ode on a Grecian Urn: beauty is truth, truth beauty. So the idea being that one strand of romantic poetry um, looks towards a kind of larger responsibility to the culture and the society, and the other finds truth in beauty and art. And that's the Keatsian one. So that's just a review of what we did last time. If you're a little bit stuck on that, you can go back to the recorded lecture for that one, or go back to your notes. Okay, so today we're talking about three poets, and the way I want to sort of frame them is in relation to their culture, the relation of culture to the larger society. And by culture here, I mean mostly, of course, I mean the relationship of art to the larger society. And of course, here we're talking about poetry, but we could also be talking about painting, fiction, um, uh, essays, etc., different kinds of writing and its relation to the larger society. So the first poet I'm going to focus on is Matthew Arnold. And Matthew Arnold is the son of a famous educator and a kind of person who was instrumental in regularizing education K through 12, I think we would call it here in the US, but basically in the primary grades. So he was very instrumental in spreading elementary school education across the UK so that it was more around. So Matthew Arnold grew up in a relatively literary household, and he became interested in philosophy and literature at a very young age, and he was really, really interested in Wordsworth, and he met Wordsworth. So Wordsworth lived until 1850, so he was the longest living of the first generation, or of either generation of Romantic poets. And uh, and Matthew Arnold sought him out and went to see him. So, a word about Matthew Arnold's idea about the relationship of culture to the larger society. Matthew Arnold felt that there were basically two distinct times, or epochs, let's say, or historical periods, two historical periods, and they tended to alternate. Um, and they were times when it was the a time for criticism and a time for making art. So Matthew Arnold's sort of feeling is that the time for making art was the 17th century, and that the 18th and 19th century had been a time for criticism, and not as much good art was made during this time. Um, so you see what he's kind of giving you here is a sort of historical dialectic, or an idea about mm, uh, about what kinds of society produce better art and which kinds of society produce better criticism. And he felt like at his current moment, it was the time for criticism, not the time for art. And he really lays out this case in an essay called "The Function of Criticism at the current at the what is it called? The Function of Criticism at the Present Time" is what it's called, and I believe it's written in the 1860s. So, so he's basically making an argument. And true to his word, Matthew Arnold stopped writing poetry after he had published several collections. I don't think he's the best poet we're going to look at here. He's a good poet, but not a great poet. And what you see in in his poetry is that he is deeply sad and nostalgic. So this nostalgia looks back on a certain time. And this is really a key feature for, I would say, a sort of Victorian sensibility, whereas Romanticism kind of looked forward and pointed to possible things that could happen, a new society, a new revolutionary world, the prophecies that Blake wanted to see, the kind of humanity that Wordsworth was calling for, or the kind of uh, sensual and sensuous and aesthetic experience that Keats was trying to talk about. That all looks forward, whereas the Victorians largely looked back, and that meant that they were more interested in classicism, or what's sometimes called neoclassicism. Neoclassicism, uh, uh, classicism, as it sounds, is kind of of a new form of classicism. So that's what the neo is. Okay, so what the poem I want to look at by Matthew Arnold is called Dover Beach. And I think you'll see this nostalgia, this sadness is kind of imbued throughout the poem. So let's go ahead and look at it. If you don't have it, if I didn't include it in the packet, I'm very sorry, but I will make sure you get it. Okay. I will tell you that as far as I know, what I was told about this poem is that it was actually written while Matthew Arnold was on his honeymoon. And so you can see how what kind of person he is, largely a slightly depressed person, kind of serious person. I guess I kind of relate to that second part. I don't think I'm depressed, but I am kind of serious. In any case, he writes this poem, which is a very kind of sad poem, or a kind of dark poem, sort of, I don't know, a poem about what we might call, and what Coleridge called, dejection, a kind of feeling of being cast low. Okay, so here it is, Dover Beach. The sea is calm tonight, the tide is full, the moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand glimmering and vast out in the tranquil bay. Come to the window, sweet is the night air. Only from the long line of spray where the sea meets the moon-blanched land, listen, You hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand, begin and cease and then begin again, with tremulous cadence, slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound a thought, hearing it in the distant northern sea. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and the round earth's shore lay in the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and the naked shingles of the world. Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Okay, so you can hear it's a strange honeymoon poem, right? Um, come to the window, look out at this beautiful scene. I know it seems beautiful, but guess what? It's actually horrible. Now, part of this has to do with ongoing tensions between England and France. So let's be clear. There is a kind of historical background. If you are, I have no idea like what the shape is, but if you imagine that this is England, right, and you imagine that this is Europe, right? Oops, the the shore, and this is the English Channel. Then France is here. So on his honeymoon, when he's at Dover Beach, he'll be looking out at France, and so that's one way to understand. On the French coast, the light gleams and is gone. Right. Um, it's amazing to me. I guess it must have been a very clear night or something that he could see across the English Channel, but he did, or he says he did. In any case, what he's dealing with here is again this sense of melancholy, this sense of dejection, and I wanted to point out again that just as I said before, he looks back to the past, to the classical past, for a kind of clue about how to move forward. And again, this is a very Victorian theme, to look back upon the past in order to figure out how to move forward, whereas the Romantics just sort of blundered forward very often. That was their way of thinking, and it had something to do with the fact that the English Empire was beginning to just slow down and wane, right? And so it wasn't like it was soon. England would no longer be the greatest economic force in the world. The United States would be. So the way to think about this, I think, would be along these lines, along the lines of melancholy, along the lines of nostalgia, and also a kind of understanding of history, right? That literary history, world history are interconnected, and in a time when it is a time for criticism or a time for thinking or philosophizing, it's not necessarily a time for making great art. In fact, Arnold didn't believe that the Romantics were as great of poets as he believed that looking back, to the Renaissance, he considered that to be the kind of golden age of English poetry with Shakespeare and Ben Jonson and John Donne and I don't know who else, other sort of poets of that period, Cooper, etc. Okay, so that's Dover Beach, and that's Matthew Arnold. So you get one response to Victorian poetry is this looking back to classical period, and that's one way to sort of deal with the problem of the egotistical sublime is just to quit poetry altogether, and right, and again, I said that it sort of, or I haven't said, but I wrote here Tennyson's um, melancholy. I think this plays into this because I think that Tennyson and Arnold share this, but Tennyson's melancholy is always kind of informed by this love of beauty and love of and a kind of attachment to the world. Where I would say that Matthew Arnold has a strange detachment from the world and a kind of he doesn't see beauty. He sees only in beauty. He sees only a kind of escape from the reality of the difficulties of um, mid-Victorian politics and culture. Okay, so the next poet I want to look forward to is Robert Browning. Um, and Robert Browning is probably, next to Tennyson, the most famous of the Victorian poets. And Robert Browning he also really loved Shelley. So what he learns from Shelley, I think, what he gets from Shelley is a kind of mm, uh, immediate um, immediate res- responsiveness to uh, to language. So his language is much richer than he has that. You remember I said that for this is a better way to put it than what I just did. I mean you can think about that. You can think about immediate responsiveness to language, but I actually like this way of formulating it better. To say that, remember I said that with Shelley, he brought ecstasy and. Okay, so sorry, I had to cut that one short. So I was just saying about Robert Browning that he brings together two different forms of together, two different modes together the same way that Shelley did, and that is that he's able to bring together um, ecstasy and the political together, and he brings them together. By ecstasy, what I really mean is intensity, uh, something like that. And the way he's able to bring together this kind of lyrical intensity and the political together without being, as Shelley was, kind of like overwrought, is he uses a new form called the dramatic monologue. Mm, there might be two M's, dramatic monologue. And he brings together, oh, there's just one M, why do I do that? He brings together the dramatic monologue. Um, and in so doing, what you get is uh, a situation where the lyric poem has a speaker that is clearly not the poet. So if you think about typical lyric poetry, like from Keats and from uh, if you think about typical lyric poetry from Keats and Wordsworth, for example, you think about someone who we believe that the speaker more or less equals the poet, right? We kind of think that there's a kind of closeness in typical lyrical poetry between the speaker and the poet. In the dramatic monologue, you have a situation that's almost the opposite, where it maximizes the distance between the speaker and the poet. And how does it do this? It does this by creating a kind of character. So you're cued in, like in the poem by Tennyson, which I told you was also a dramatic monologue, the poem Ulysses, you're tuned in that the speaker of the poem is actually uh, um, a character from Homer, and it's not Tennyson. And you're able to follow along knowing that it is this character. Um, uh, um, t- Similarly, in the poem we're going to look at today, um, Porphyria's Lover, you're cued in um, that the speaker is not Robert Browning. And in this case, it's a little more complicated. You find out that it's not um, Browning, because Browning would not be the kind of speaker that would do the kind of horrific things that this speaker does. So, um, so the way I will kind of frame this for you is to say that the person who sets this up for us is Byron. Byron creates the conditions for the for the dramatic monologue by um, bringing in this thing we call the Byronic hero, right? Um, the Byronic hero is a kind of proto version of the dramatic monologue. So, in writing Don Juan and writing Childe Harold's Pilgrimage in the 1810s and 1820s, he makes possible the fully fledged dramatic monologue, which really takes shape, I would say, did I say the 1810s? That's what I meant, the 1810s and the 1820s. It really finds its way into full flower in the dramatic monologue in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s with Tennyson and Browning. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what that looks like. The poem we're going to look at, which is in your packet, is called let's see, where is it? Oh shoot, where did I put it? Hold up. I need to get it. Okay, sorry, I seem to be having a really hard time today. Maybe it's just easier to do this in the classroom than it is at my home. So, as I said, let's look at this poem. Let's look at this poem, Porphyria's Lover. All right. And I think it'll be clear as we follow this how this is a dramatic monologue. The rain set in. Oh, let me start over again. The rain set early in tonight. The sullen wind was soon awake. It tore the elm tops down for spite and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened with a heart fit to break when glided in Porphyria straight. She shut the cold out and the storm, and kneeled and made the cheerless grate blaze up and all the cottage warm, which done she rose and from her form withdrew the dripping cloak and shawl, and laid her soiled gloves by, untied her hat, and let the damp hair fall. And last she sat down by my side and called me, and when no voice replied, she put her arm about my waist, and made her smooth white shoulder bare, and all her yellow hair displaced, and stooping, made my cheek lie there, and spread o'er all her yellow hair, murmuring how she loved me, she, too weak for all her heart's endeavor to set its struggling passion free from pride and vainer ties dissever, and give herself to me forever. but passion sometimes would prevail, nor could tonight's gay feast restrain a sudden thought of one so pale, for love of her, and all in vain. So she was come through wind and rain. Be sure, I looked up at her eyes, happy and proud. At last I knew Porphyria worshipped me. Surprise made my heart swell, and still it grew while I debated what to do. That moment she was mine, mine, fair, perfectly pure and good. I found a thing to do, and all her hair in one long yellow string I wound 3 times her little throat around and strangled her. No pain felt she. I am quite sure she felt no pain, as a shut bud that holds a bee. I warily oped her eyes, again laughed the blue eyes without a stain, and I untightened next the tress about her neck. Her cheek once more blushed bright beneath my burning kiss. I propped her head up as before, only this time my shoulder bore her head, which droops upon it still, the smiling, rosy little head, so glad it has its utmost will, that all it scorned at once is fled, and I its love am gained instead. Porphyria's love. She guessed not how her darling one wish would be heard. Thus we sit together now, and all night we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. Okay, so this is a terrifying poem, right? I love this poem. I think it's pretty awesome. He wrote a number, I would say a majority of these poems were, during this period, were um, dramatic monologues. And what he does, as I said before, let me return to this. The dramatic monologue maximizes the distance between the speaker and the poet. All right, that's very important to remember. What you have here is, because we have that distance, we can enter into the poem without cringing, without thinking this is Browning. And by doing this, Browning can critique society in a certain way. So that's the other thing that dramatic monologue does. Dramatic monologue makes it possible to critique society in a way that you couldn't critique society if you were just to say, um, I don't know, men wish to possess women, that's a bad thing. Uh, Men are abusive and controlling, etc. While that might be fine, it probably wouldn't be a good poem. This poem allows us to enter into a character, well before we had TV movies, or obviously way before we had any, cinema or even photography. We had the ability to do these dramatic monologues, which kind of created for us little pictures of these interesting and sometimes horrific people, like the speaker in this poem. Um, I think this would be a great poem to do for a close reading if you wanted to. The thing to catch here is that the form is very, very, very interesting, because it goes A B, C D, etc. like this. Oh wait, no, does it? A B. Hold on, let me just check it because it's a little complicated. A B C. Oh, A B B B C. No, straight is different than break, so let's treat that differently. A B C. Break lake. No, B is break is lake. I'm sorry. All right, I'll get this right. A B A B B C D C D D. That's the way it works, right? So there's this couplet inside of a kind of A B form. It's a very complicated form, and there's so much enjambment, right? You remember what enjambment is? If not, look it up in the terms and concepts, and that really helps. Like here's an enjambed line. As I was reading, I noticed lots of them were enjambed, um, and these enjambed lines allow us to read it through without becoming overwhelmed by the rhyme. Um, so that's partly the form of the poem. I think the other thing to focus on would be the way in which the speaker has a fantasy that, or maybe Porphyria says this. She comes to him and she says, "Oh, you know." The way I understand it, she says something like, "Oh, I was out and I couldn't help but seeing some other guys at the bar, but I really love you and only you. I wish I wasn't so, but they offered to buy me drinks. I wish I wasn't so, um, I wish I was stronger and wouldn't succumb to these weaknesses." And he recognizes that she loves her, and then he kills her at exactly the moment when he feels that she's looking at him with love, so he could arrest that look of love in her eyes. So yes, that's the way I I understand the kind of psychology of the speaker. And of course, the damning part is at the end where he says, "And God has not said a word." So there's this sense that um, Browning is making kind of 2 points here, two different forms of critique. The first is that men seek to possess women, and they possess women as objects in this certain way. That's the first part of the critique, and there's a kind of violence done even if the woman isn't killed when she is kind of treated as an object. But secondly, there's a critique of a society that would allow this to happen. Um, and all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. Okay, I think this is enough for the mini lecture. We'll just stop with Matthew Arnold and Robert Browning, and I will take up Swinburne on our class. Actually, it'll work perfectly for me to take up Swinburne on our class on Monday. Okay, so have a nice weekend. Make sure you go online after listening and watching this and do the